Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on eco-anxiety. I don't know about you, but this was a term that I did not know very much about until I was told I'd be moderating this session. So it's something that actually has not been in the dictionary for a very long time, certainly has not shown up in the past 50 to 100 years, because this is really the moment now where we have enough information to know that there is a massive climate crisis that is happening, and climate anxiety is something that is closely linked to that. So, as you might know, the climate urgency is a big global concern, but it goes further than that. Not only is this a big political question, a problem that we're trying to solve at a socioeconomic level, a problem that we're trying to solve through business, but actually it's an issue, a challenge that we have that's actually affecting our mental health and well-being as well. There are a lot of feelings that can come up when we think about these massive global challenges and we think, gosh, I'm just one person, what can I do? The feelings can be what we would label as negative. Sometimes they can be more on the positive. It can be anything from inspiration and feeling motivated to make a massive difference to feeling resigned, maybe feeling despair, maybe feeling depressed or anxious about the climate crisis. Today, we are here to validate some of those feelings, to say it's actually really okay to feel that way if you feel that way, and to explore actually how do we deal with these emotions as they come up for us. We've got some amazing experts from across the globe who are going to lead us through a conversation to unpack this really complex issue for us and give us some tips and tricks on how we can address our own eco-anxiety should we have it. We're going to start our session off first with a keynote speech. After that, we'll move into a panel discussion, and then we're in for a very big treat, which is the first time this is happening on the Change Now stage. We are actually going to be opening up to a question and answer period. So if you have any questions that come up as you're listening to our speakers speak, please take a note of that. You will have an opportunity at the end of our session to pose those questions to our expert speakers. One big request is let's keep them succinct so as many people as possible can get a question in. And I'm going to have the same request for our speakers that we make sure that they're nice and succinct answers so that we can make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak who wants a chance to speak. All right. Without further ado, I think it's time that we get our keynote speaker on this stage. His name is Patrick Kennedy-Williams. Patrick is a leading expert in the field of climate change-related mental health. He holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Oxford and is co-director of Climate Psychologists. That's an independent organization providing therapeutic support and wider consultation regarding the mental health implications of climate change. Patrick has collaborated with local and national governments, businesses, as well as educators on community-based initiatives for climate anxiety, fostering people-centered and sustainable change towards what we call net zero. He is also the author of Turn the Tide on Climate Anxiety. Please, everyone, give a nice, warm welcome to Patrick.
Thank you so much, Martina. I've got some slides. Oh, they're here already. That's fantastically quick. Thank you. I have the honor of setting the scene today in this conversation regarding eco-anxiety, and also to then hand the mic over to three people in Megan, Britt, and Clover who are doing, frankly, extraordinary and humbling things. And I think it's fair to say that all of us are doing these things not despite eco-anxiety, but alongside it. And my hope is that you'll come away from today's session with two things. Firstly, a better and deeper understanding of eco-anxiety and what it is. And secondly, a bit of more of an idea and a sense of, in the climate work that I know in the forum we are here, that you're all doing already, how to make that truly sustainable. And what we mean by that is action that is sustainable for the planet, but yourselves as well. And I'm going to start off by just a quick show of hands. And I warn you, I'm a psychologist, so I'm very comfortable asking how you feel, okay? Has climate change or the climate crisis made you feel any of the following? And as I read them out, if it's a yes, just raise your hand. Afraid. Okay. Motivated. Good. Angry. Helpless. Guilty. Optimistic. Uninterested. I'm very glad to see so many hands going down at the end there. So what we can already start to say is that when we're talking about eco-anxiety, we're actually talking about so much more than anxiety. And here's what happened when a group of young people were asked the same question. And I think this is a testament to this. I mean, this is 3 years old now. Actually, in the past few years, these numbers will all have increased dramatically since then. But it paints a very similar picture, is high levels of fear, high levels of motivation, and other emotions alongside all of these. So our job is to work out how to harness all of these strong emotions, be they unpleasant to experience, pleasant to experience, whenever we interact with the climate crisis. I love coming to events like this because invariably I'll be asked, either in a Q&A or somewhere in the halls, climate psychologist, what on earth is a climate psychologist? And I love that question. I welcome that question because what it does is it gives us a space to talk about the psychological dimensions of the climate crisis. My origin story was that I was working in Oxford. In fact, my PhD supervisor was on this stage 45 minutes ago talking about her work in Oxford in trauma. It was incredible seeing her talk about this. So we were working with staff groups, paramedics, first responders on burnout, compassion, fatigue, and work-related trauma. Around the same time, somebody came to visit me who was a climate scientist, and he then described what we now understand to be climate anxiety. He was finding it overwhelming to continue the work that he was doing. He knew it was important, but he was struggling to make it into the office. It was affecting his sleep, it was affecting his social life, and his ability to thrive and enjoy the life he was having. He's then gone on to do incredible things. Again, not despite eco-anxiety or by overcoming eco-anxiety, by working out a way of moving alongside it. So this then kind of put me to work. And it made me think at that time, we don't have models of understanding as psychologists that enable us to work out how to support people that have this new thing called eco-anxiety. And I also, as someone who's always been passionate about environmentalism and environmental causes, this felt like a real motivator for me. Something else then amazing happened, fast forward a little bit of time, in 2019, where really the climate crisis in that year hit the mainstream. It was, and at the same time, in fact, the Oxford English Dictionary word of the year in 2019 was climate emergency. And all the words that were in the shortlist that year were related to the climate crisis. And moreover, our emotional response to the climate crisis. What was happening then, and then in 2019, we started seeing eco-anxiety coming up in books, on TV, in movies. We were being asked to speak about it publicly. What happened was the climate crisis and our emotional responses to the climate crisis entered into what we call the Overton window, the acceptable window of public discourse. What that meant was there was what was previously considered to be radical and unthinkable, all of a sudden became common parlance and in the minds of the public. And then now, since then, what's been starting to happen is it's been influencing governmental policy and organizational behavior. So do not for a second underestimate the power of talking about climate change. And as we all are here this morning, talking about the emotional impacts of climate change and how it makes us feel. Because what we're all doing is we're creating a strong social mandate to see the changes that we want to see at government level and in corporations. So what is it about climate change? It's a bit of a mind fuddle. For many reasons. We know that when we engage with the climate crisis, it activates all kinds of psychological, very normal human psychological defenses. It can inspire denial, distancing. We can over-intellectualize. But it's also unique, the climate crisis, from a psychological perspective as well. I'm often asked, well, isn't eco-anxiety a bit like another existential crisis we might have experienced, like nuclear anxiety around the time of the Cold War, and more recently with the war in Ukraine? Good question. There are definitely overlaps, but I would argue what makes eco-anxiety distinct from that is that the response that's required by all of us. And we're talking about the climate crisis. What we're saying is, actually, our response needs to be active and sustained. It affects the daily decisions we make. It affects how we run our businesses. It affects how we spend our money, how we vote. So what's required of all of us in terms of our psychological response to the climate crisis, I would say, is unique. So the American Psychological Association defined climate anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom. But actually, we know that it's much more than that. And something else I want to say is that we are not here, and I know the panel agrees with me on this, we are not here to pathologize in any way our emotional responses to climate change. Eco-anxiety is a rational response to the existential crisis that we're all facing. But it can be debilitating. It can lead to panic, sleeplessness, and it can ultimately lead to inaction, which creates a problem, of course, for all of those that want to be engaged in sustainability. We know that in the USA, 69% of people now worry about climate change. In an incredibly important study that Britt was a part of last year, we know that now 3/4 of young people describe the future of the world as frightening, and that number rises to 81% in Portugal, 93% in the Philippines. Why those countries? Because they're at the forefront of a changing climate. So what we can also say is, unfortunately, as these weather events increase, so too will rates of climate anxiety. It's also linked, climate anxiety has also been shown in that study to link to government inaction. So what we can also start to say is we need to start thinking of eco-anxiety in a whole systems context. It's deeply rooted in climate justice and intersectional environmentalism and not an individual pathology. We also know that eco-anxiety is a powerful motivator for change. I've heard people say countless times a little eco-anxiety can be a good thing. And when we first started, we always used to say the same cure for the cure for climate change is the same as the cure for climate anxiety. It's about taking climate action. And that still holds true, but we've had to be more nuanced about it in the intervening years. And so now what we say is it's about sustainable climate action. Action that's sustainable for the planet, but also sustainable for you. So what does a sustainable climate action look like? Well, we like to think of it in these 3 areas. And I want all of you to be thinking about how this translates to you and your lives and your work. How can I have the greatest impact? But also, what skill set do I already have? It's okay to make it easy. Follow the path of least resistance. What am I already doing? What strengths do I bring to this? And also, how can I locate this in my values? What gives me meaning? When climatologist Michael Mann reviewed our latest book, he said, when it comes to climate action, the obstacles we face are no longer technological. They're primarily political and psychological in nature. This was a humbling moment for me, but one that really solidified my sense of impact that I can be having as a psychologist in this space. And I'd say the same for Britt in science communication, same for Clover in terms of activism, same for Megan in terms of coaching. As psychologists, we want to make ourselves unemployed. It's a terrible business model we have as psychologists. We want to make ourselves unnecessary to people and communities. The last thing we want is everybody seeking therapy for climate anxiety. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big proponent of therapy. But what we want instead is to support and build an infrastructure for people, businesses, and governments where climate awareness and climate education is as well deeply rooted in climate emotions and psychological thinking. So what gives me meaning? My daughter, Megan's daughter, drew this about 2 weeks ago. It's not of me, I should say. This is Megan. This gives me meaning. I'm doing this for her. I want her to grow up to feel inspired. I want her to feel motivated. I want her to feel climate aware. I want her to be able to connect with the millions of people around the world who are fighting for climate justice. This, for me, is my sense of meaning. So ask yourself, what corner of the climate crisis am I involved in? Where can I have impact? Where can I find my meaning? But also allow for your emotions to breathe. Connect with people. Connect with the planet. And use the power of your emotions to drive positive change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for setting the stage for us so beautifully for this really sometimes complex conversation that we're about to host here on stage, framing some of the concepts, some of the terminology that we need to be familiar with to really have a good conversation about this. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to introduce some of those people that Patrick had already alluded to, our panelists that are here with us today, experts on climate anxiety. And we will start off, I will introduce everyone, and then we'll bring them all on stage at once. So, first and foremost, we have Dr. Britt Wray. She is a Human and Planetary Health Fellow at Stanford University and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she researches the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. She is the author of a new book about eco-anxiety called Generation Dread: Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis. She's also the creator of the widely read Gen Dread newsletter, which is about staying sane in the climate crisis. I love that. Next, we have Clover Hogan. Clover is a climate activist and the founding executive director of Force of Nature, a youth not-for-profit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. She has worked alongside the world's leading authorities on sustainability, consulted with Fortune 500 companies, and supported students in 50-plus countries, no small feat, to shift from climate anxiety to climate agency. She's been inspiring people to step up rather than shut down in the face of the climate crisis. Lastly, we have Megan Kennedy-Woodard. Megan is the co-founder of Climate Psychologists and co-author of Turn the Tide on Climate Anxiety and the upcoming children's book, Unstoppable Us. Please, ladies, welcome to the Change Now stage. Come on up. Pick a seat, any seat, and we'll save one seat at the end because Patrick will be joining us at the end for the Q&A as well, so you'll get the benefit of all the experts answering your questions. So, where do we start? Where do we even start to unpack this seemingly massive topic? I think first and foremost, me and the audience want to hear about what it is that you're doing, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, but without focusing too much on the problem, because we are here to talk solutions, what is the solution that you're presenting in the world here to really move the dial? I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and big thank you to Patrick for setting the scene so well, covering the science so that I don't have to remember the numbers. Much appreciated. So, for a little bit of context, I woke up to the climate crisis when I was 11 years old. I was very lucky to grow up in a beautiful part of Australia where I spent most of my time fishing frogs from the toilet and pulling snakes out of my boots. So I grew up with a really deep and profound awe and appreciation for the nature all around me. And at 11, I discovered documentaries. I watched An Inconvenient Truth, The Cove, Food Inc., and it felt like the rug was being pulled out from beneath my feet. I remember feeling a deep and profound sadness that has stayed with me to this day. I remember feeling angry, but perhaps more than anything else, I remember feeling deeply confused. I couldn't understand how I had not learnt about the climate crisis in school, why I hadn't seen it on the TV when my parents watched the news, why we didn't talk about it at the dinner table. So over the dinner table, I promptly announced to my parents that I wanted to become an environmentalist, and that is the path that I forged for myself. But in my activism, I felt that the way to deal with those really difficult emotions was to cling on to optimism and determination and hope. And I felt that if I opened the door to those very feelings that had catalyzed me to take action in the first place, I would fall into them and I would never come out. But that mental gymnastics came to a halt in November of 2019 during the fires back home in Australia. I grew up in a bubble of relative climate privilege where it was something that I read about and watched documentaries about. But for the first time, it was the direct cause of loss for my culture, for the places that had made me an environmentalist. I remember reading the headlines, 2 billion animals incinerated in the inferno. I watched films videos from my friends standing on the roofs of their homes, holding hoses, trying to beat back the flames and smoke. And I fell into a well of climate despair and hopelessness that lasted many months. But I found great validation and liberation talking about those feelings. And the more I talked about how I was feeling, the more people from all corners of the world started to reach out to me. And it was against that backdrop that I launched Force of Nature, now a 12-person team, which is supporting young people from over 50 countries to understand these necessary climate emotions, which Patrick spoke to, understand how to channel them into action, and creating pathways for young people to directly interface with decision makers across business and policy so that those who are sleepwalking toward this cliff of climate collapse are invited to confront those emotions, and through that intergenerational exchange kind of break out of this spell of apathy which has taken over so much of our society.
Yeah, beautiful, thank you. And Britt, did you want to go next?
Sure. So great to be here. Thank you. I'll just start with something that happened to me this morning. I woke up, and as I always do, checked my email. The first one that I saw had the subject line, "I can't take it anymore." And I opened it up, and it was from a young woman in New York, early 20s, describing that she can not bear her climate anxiety and grief, and that she is suicidal, and that she needs someone to talk to about it. She needs to know that she's not crazy. She feels completely gaslit by her family and the culture at large, an emotionally immature society that is not taking these emotions of young people seriously and prioritizing responding to them. And I get these emails, unfortunately, regularly, because I run this website and newsletter about staying sane in the climate crisis, which is meant to normalize the fact that many of us have these distressing, big climate and ecological emotions so that we can move through them with support. And yet so many people still feel so isolated and alienated and distressed because we aren't doing the good work of piercing the bubble of silence around these feelings. And so Gen Dread is my newsletter where I attempt to hold this out for others, and the community that is gathering around it provides me a lot of resilient hope and radical hope about how we can move through to the other side, the far side of despair and hopelessness on these issues together when we do have these tough conversations. And it is powerful, and it really has shown up in my own life as being evident and true. I've had my own eco-anxiety journeys. I've been in the kind of bottom of the U-shaped curve that Clover has been in around the bushfires. For me personally, several years ago, when confronting with my partner whether or not we wanted to try and get pregnant, as a science communicator, ingesting all the dire scientific evidence all the time and squaring that with the lack of effective action at global scale, it birthed this very painful dilemma for me when I questioned, is it wise, is it compassionate to bring a new child into a world filled with climate disruption? And then I had to confront my ecological emotions on a whole new level that I hadn't before. And that led me to see, okay, A, am I deviant for thinking this way and connecting family planning to the climate crisis? Did a little bit of searching, found out there was a very frothing conversation just beneath the surface of how many young people were feeling this, which had since, in those few years, risen very much above the surface. We have tons of statistics, academics studying it, young people putting it on their placards when they hit the streets. And I thought, okay, well, this reproductive anxiety piece is just a tiny sliver of the other psychological impacts of the climate crisis, which led me to write this book, Generation Dread, which is about, trying through that shared space of understanding from my own experience, then shed light on all the amazing work that's being done at the burgeoning intersection of climate and mental health to help people cope, but also look at the acute trauma from climate disasters and what really needs to be reshaped in the mental health field as we move together in a rapidly changing world to increase access to the support that's required. And then lastly, I'll just say one project I'm working at Stanford University, we are starting a new initiative on climate and mental health in the School of Medicine. And what we aim to do is educate a new cohort of young people who are focusing on this intersection, no longer believing that they're hermetically sealed separate topics, focus on leadership, getting out into the community, engagement with policymakers, and of course research to fill in the missing evidence gaps and understand what interventions can work aside from the big intervention we know we need, which is effective climate action. But while we don't have that at the scale required, we also need to innovate to support each other with the emotional toll of bearing witness to loss and struggle in a heating world.
Thank you, Megan.
And as Patrick mentioned, I'm a co-founder of Climate Psychologists as well, so I don't want to reiterate too much about what we do and take that time away. But for us, I think it's really about meeting people where they are. And people are in very different places in their climate journey. Some people are trapped in paralysis because of the effects the emotions have. Some people are powering through in climate action, but in a way that may not be necessarily sustainable, and they need to actually connect more and give themselves permission to take more self-care, more time. And so we decided that it was really important to develop some practical tools, some communication, some spaces where people could come wherever they were in their journey and really cultivate that sense of abundance and that ability to stay in the zone of action. So we've written Turn the Tide on Climate Anxiety, and it's kind of a practical tool guide of how to maintain that, that action. So I'll pass it there because he said a lot about this already.
Thank you so much, ladies. It's, I think for me, it's really great to know that there are people out there who are making such a dynamic impact in this space and sharing that ultimately these feelings that we can have around, this massive global crisis they're normal. They're absolutely normal, and we're all going to meet them in a different way. We're all going to have a different response. Some people might feel inspired. We want to move forward immediately. There's that determination that comes through. But ultimately, and I think you alluded to this a little bit too, Megan, it does take a certain amount of energy, I think, to continue to face these feelings. It's one thing for it to come up, the first shock maybe when you started watching those documentaries of, oh my goodness, what's happening on the planet is tragic. I really need to be doing something. And there's, that emotional upswelling. But then it doesn't go away, does it? Those feelings in many ways can last over time. And so I'm curious how you're approaching those feelings, whether they started off as, very dramatic and large, but how do you, and I think, Megan, you talked about this a little bit when we spoke earlier, how do you maintain a certain level of energy to be able to continue to support yourself through all of this as you're, going down the journey pathway?
Well, I'm a coach, so I love a good metaphor. And I would ask, who here would join me to run a marathon? No, there are not a lot of hands rising up. Okay, there are a few.
Not a lot of runners in the crowd.
I don't need to ask Clover because she's about to do this. But okay, so a lot of people feel like, oh, that's a horrible idea. Oh, that's way too big. That would be way too hard. That sounds too difficult. And some people are like, yeah, sounds like a challenge. I'm up for it. Let's try it. And I think that's very similar to what I equate to as the climate marathon, because I find the two very similar. Marathons are very emotional. People go through a swell of emotions in the run-up to it while they're taking part. They might feel lack of self-efficacy. They might feel motivated. It's a real range. You can't sprint a marathon. You can't sprint the climate marathon. This is something that takes long-term attention with not immediate rewards. And so it's really important to view this work as something that we take day by day, and we'll suffer setbacks. There'll be times where we make mistakes. We run into those unexpected hills, twisted ankles, the projects that we want to launch, the people that we talk to don't get it. We'll suffer these setbacks. And so it's really important to take that self-care as you do with a marathon. You take care of your body, you take care of your mind, and you build that resilience and that perseverance that allows you to keep going. I also know that there are mile markers along the way in marathons, and that's to signal to us that we're making positive, we're getting there, we're going how far we need to go, if we need to speed up our work to get it to our goal, or actually we need to give ourselves a bit of a break. And when we get to the end of that finish line, there's really that importance of celebrating, because, it's not like, oh, I cured climate change today. It's like, oh, I launched that project today. I had a positive conversation with someone today. We need to really acknowledge that we are making, we're chipping away, and we need to keep going. I also love that marathons are really inclusive, and I find that that's so important in the climate marathon, because everyone has a role to play, and we very much believe this is an everybody now thing. Everyone's going to be bringing different stories and histories and experiences, and people of any ability, any race, it's so inclusive, and I love that, because my favorite thing about a marathon or the climate marathon is that it's run alongside others. You know, there's very much this feeling of camaraderie. You look to the people next to you. If they're struggling, you say, come on, you've got this. The people in the crowd, and everyone's going for it. And when you need that help, you're able to reach out and say, like, give me an up, you know? And so I feel like it's really important to pace ourselves, to take that self-care, to signal positive, you know, as we're going along and celebrate. And so, yeah, coaches love that.
I love that. It's a really clear metaphor, right? And you explained it beautifully. I think you know, there are a lot of pieces to you know, to this entire journey that can be difficult, can be complex, and yet if you're looking at it from the perspective of, you know, this is an ongoing journey and we can see the positive here and there, we need to actually stop and take note of that. I think that's really important. Not always just stare at the, you know, at the hard stuff, but take a moment to really look at, hey, you know, we are making progress, we are speaking to policymakers, we are seeing differences, you know, or maybe I'm starting a small initiative in my community or in my family, and that feels like something good, and taking note of that. Framing it that way, I think, is really a really strong way to go. And what about you two? I feel like you're in a space where it seems like you've had your own personal journeys around, you know, all the feelings that come up for you, but you're also both supporting others as they go through their journeys as well. So I'd love to hear both of those takes. How did you support yourself, and then how are you actually creating the space where you can then be that support, you know, running along in the marathon as well alongside other people? Whichever one of you wants to go first.
When I started going through this period of climate grief during the fires back home, I started chatting to a kind of mutual friend of ours, Caroline Hickman, a climate psychotherapist. And one of the beliefs that she helped surface for me was that watching the fires back home felt like a personal failure. Like, I felt, this is my fault. I haven't worked hard enough. I haven't given, you know, enough of myself to this movement. And I think that's how many of us feel. You know, activism is so deeply interwoven with our identities, and it's nearly impossible not to attach yourself to the outcome, to your expectations. And yet I needed to challenge that, and I needed to confront the very scary reality that there is every chance that we will fail. And we also have to kind of challenge this binary of what it means to succeed or fail. Because the reality is, we've already failed on many levels. We've already sacrificed countless species and frontline communities. We've already lost a huge part of ourselves. There's a certain level of global heating that is already locked in, even if we were to stop emitting tomorrow. And so we have to confront that uncertainty, and we have to reground in what motivation and success looks like for each of us. And so I no longer live out in 2050 and the kind of terrifying statistics that science tells us. I really try to reground in the present moment, and the community that we've built at Force of Nature of young people from really every corner allow me to do exactly that. And I think the most challenging thing when I first woke up to these feelings was the sense of isolation and the alienation that I felt. However, I now have the enormous privilege of getting to talk to young people every single day who feel exactly the same way, which gives me a profound sense of solidarity and a profound sense of motivation, because I'm not doing this work for an intangible reality in the future. I'm doing it for the present moment, and because I want to be able to look back on my life and not see myself as someone who sat on the sidelines choosing to give over to despair and apathy, but someone who chose to do something about them.
Yeah, you're really choosing your own destiny in a way by acting in the moment every day, it sounds like. That's powerful. Britt?
It's so beautifully said, Clover, and it relates to one of my biggest lessons from doing this work as well, which is instead of offloading all of our distress and frustration about this crisis into the need for a certain outcome that we grasp for, finding yourself repositioned so that you can continuously take action in the moment for the present moment rightness of it, no matter what happens, even if we continue to see failure and slide down that scale, which is an existentially resilient place to move from and to open oneself into how the world is in your reality. That you can really respond thoughtfully and with care in the face of choiceless events when you bring that agency into the way that you move every day, even when things are getting tougher. And in terms of the marathon, it's so key being able to fill up our cup enough so that we can come together with others and move forward. I think of it as emotional weight training. You know, what are the things that you have for your own internal activism that supports your external activism, whether that's mindfulness and meditation, whether that's, you know, speaking with trusted ones in a containing setting, psychology speak, for making sure that you can find those spaces where you will never be told you're being dramatic for being distressed about the climate crisis. You will never have someone say, oh, don't be so dire, you're fine, or minimize the pain, but they will validate it, they will legitimize it, they will mirror it. And when you have that, I can't tell you how many people immediately speak of relief. It's like the hugest weight gets lifted off your shoulders, because many of us are still living in this system whereby the feelings are disenfranchised, right? Ecological grief is a type of grief that's similar to what you get with abortions and suicides and, you know, miscarriage, the kind of grief that is not talked about. But we move better through grief with support and with others and when it's validated. And this is real. And it's okay to feel this, and it's a sign that you care and that you're compassionate to what we're losing, right? So there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a super human and humane way to be. The trick, of course, is to not get caught in any one dire place with it. And so that approach of taking actions for the present moment rightness of it, no matter what, really helps me. And then also having colleagues, like being with the people who have their eyes open to this 8+ hours a day. I mean, that takes a real psychological toll to stare into the abyss of the climate crisis like that. And we have emotional hangovers from it. So I come together with climate journalists, you know, climate podcasters, climate aware therapists, climate scientists, and we meet on purpose just to debrief and unload, you know, about what weird thing happened that was super distressing when the importance of all this was denied in the last couple weeks or whatever it might be. Yeah. And that really helps me.
Yeah. I feel like what I hear under, you know, all three of your different analogies is, you know, isolation is probably one of the worst things that we can do for ourselves, is just to sort of fall into our own bubbles and stay in there, not reach out to others, because there are other people who are going through something similar. There are support systems, there are care systems, there are psychologists, psychiatrists who are, you know, there at the ready to be able to help with these kinds of things. And, you know, speaking of not being isolated, we have an amazing audience here who I'd love to sort of open this out a little bit more here to, you know, to everybody who's in the room as well, and see if we can come up with a little bit of a challenge or an opportunity that we could share with the audience of something that they could do for themselves, you know, as they go home, as they grapple this situation. There's sort of maybe one change that they could make today, or this weekend, or as soon as possible, let's call it, in their lives to, you know, to help in this sphere, to move things along. Whoever wants to go first, go as you're inspired.
So I think when I first got involved, we were a little late to the party because we already had 2 children when the climate crisis sort of resonated with us and we really understood what was happening. So we had to get our asses in gear and like get to work. And so following sort of the ease impacts meaning model, I just went straight into coaching and climate coaching and trying to keep people that are working in sustainability sustained. And I kept seeing that there was this gap. There was the emotions and there was the action, but there was something that wasn't happening in the middle that meant that it was going to stick. And it sort of revealed itself to be values. And so, we started questioning with curiosity. Why am I feeling anxious? Why am I feeling angry? What is that coming from? So, I'm worried about future generations. I'm worried about my children. What value is that based in? And it's love. Or, I'm so angry that this injustice is happening. It's like, okay, well, you believe in security for all people, and it's like that's a good place to base your action rather than something that feels much more scarce, of angry or anxious, or it's like actually if we can use those. they're not negative emotions, but they're valid emotions, but translate them to actual values, that's where the actions become much more focused, much more easily broken down in steps that can, follow a path to success. And that's where people stay more resilient because they actually can see, they can anchor back to the value rather than the emotion that can go up and down and up and down. So we want to, rather than floating in that space, anchor there.
Okay, so anchor in values. That's your challenge to the audience. Okay, beautiful. Britt, what about you?
So my colleagues and I did this study of 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds in 10 countries around the world, trying to understand the scope and burden of climate anxiety in their lives. We were looking at places like India, Philippines, Nigeria, but also France, US, UK, spanning low, middle, and high-income countries. And we found, 45% of these young people said that their feelings about climate are impacting their daily functioning, eating, sleeping, working, going to school, playing, having fun. 56% feel that humanity is doomed, which is a horrifically sad statistic to let land in your heart. And 39% said that the climate crisis is making them hesitant to have their own children. But what's actionable here is that we found, importantly, these feelings were not just there because the environment isn't doing well, but they're tightly correlated with these young people's sense of being betrayed by governments and lied to by leaders, which introduces a crucial concept of institutional betrayal, and how psychologically injurious it is when people with less power rely on those with more power to protect them, and they are failing to uphold their responsibility. So when we understand the political nature of these emotions, as individuals who might be living with them, we can move into a space of empowerment. We can understand that there is a moral righteousness, which is fair, about the feelings, and we can come together with others to talk about this rather than to sit in shame around the fact that it's living within our bodies. So I would invite people, especially because you're here, you're engaged. I bet that everyone has some version of climate emotion. It doesn't need to be the most dire that we're sometimes talking about, but even just the light versions. And create a space where it's okay to have frank conversation about how this is showing up in your lives, what your fears are, what your hopes are, what can nourish you and bring joy while allowing you to stay close to the tough stuff and stay with this problem rather than turn away out of self-preservation. And when we do that together in community and we see that we're moving through waves of people in a growing collection of humanity that's being moved by inner clarity on their purpose and meaning that comes from these difficult emotions, that's hugely strengthening in itself. But we can't get there if we're not talking about it. We need to do more than just talk about climate change. We need to talk about the climate emotions too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Clover, rapid fire, can you give us your challenge as well?
Yeah, for sure. Well, just building off that, I always like to ask the question, who benefits from the system staying the same? Like, who benefits from people continuing to kind of sleepwalk toward the edge of this cliff of climate collapse? And Michael Eman, the climate scientist, has been doing some really interesting work unpacking the tactics used by the fossil fuel industry to deny the science, to delay, to distract people. And one of their most recent tactics is to really encourage this kind of climate doomism and this shutting down into despair, saying the problem is too enormous, our systems are too broken. Like, the fossil fuel industry benefits from us switching off from this crisis. And for me, that stokes the fire in my belly that says, how dare you? And because of that, I'm going to double down. I'm going to take more action. I'm going to open my heart to these feelings and allow them to be the fuel that motivates me. And so my encouragement, building off all of the panelists here today, is just lean into those feelings and allow them to be the compass that directs you to the problem that ignites that fire in your belly, right? So much of our overwhelm comes from feeling that we have to spread ourselves thin across all of the issues, but our impact comes from focus. And the climate crisis is a symptom of many interconnected problems, from the clothes that I'm wearing to the food in my fridge to how I get around to how we're, electrifying this building, right? And so there is no shortage of problems, but there is a shortage of people putting their hands up and saying, well, this is the piece of the puzzle that I want to own. So my provocation and call to action would be lean in, listen to those feelings, and find your impact from focus.
Love that. Love that. That is a beautiful way, I think, to wrap up our panel. And what I'm going to do now is invite Patrick back on stage, because what we're going to do is, for the first time ever at ChangeNOW, open it up to Q&A. So Patrick, if you want to come back up, we will actually be taking questions from the public. So if you have a question for one of our experts here, while everyone gets settled in, please queue up. The ChangeNOW team is around with a microphone just over here. So if you have a question, maybe just raise your hand. And what I'm going to ask is please keep your questions as succinct as possible so we can get as many questions in as possible. So we've got a microphone coming over to you here. And if there's a specific panelist that you'd like to address the question to as well, feel free to say, I'd specifically like an answer from this person. Go ahead. What is your question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your session. My question is addressed to all of you, so everyone can answer. Myself, I am from Russia here, and actually in my school I was studying in France for last year, and in the final of our course we've been doing a movie on eco-anxiety in partnership with Leseco. And I was able to feel all of this, to feel all the eco-anxiety, only because I had this experience of anxiety for the different reason, for the reason of war, for the reason of my country waging a very aggressive and horrible war. And in the beginning, you told Patrick that anxiety about the war, for example, or any other reason, could be famine or etc., is different from the eco-anxiety. But can you maybe, you personally and maybe other people, can you uncover the differences and maybe what can we learn and what can we, how can we solve the problem?
Thank you.
Shall I start with that one? I mean, thank you so much for sharing such a personal story as well. And like I said earlier, we're asked this a lot. I don't know if this is the experience of you guys as well. What makes this distinct and different? Should we be considering this as a different problem? The DSM, the sort of psychiatric Bible, if you like, if you want to call it that, of mental disorders, is in between incarnations, and there's a conversation. Should eco-anxiety be considered as sort of an anxiety disorder? I was really glad to see the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK and elsewhere around the world are coming out and saying, no, this is a normal response to an existential threat, but we're still feeling it, right? It's still it's an emotion we're still feeling. So what we don't want is for these messages to be misconstrued as saying, no, this isn't valid, right? These emotions aren't valid because it doesn't have a diagnostic label. That's the first thing to say. And I think where there are sort of existential anxieties, I mean, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the people who I've spoken with might have noticed that their style of coping in response to the climate crisis, they may have noticed elsewhere in their lives before. Right? If they have a tendency towards worry, if they have a tendency towards action, if they have a tendency towards feeling a sense of grief. And so, of course, as a result of this, we're going to be feeling some things that might be familiar to us elsewhere in our lives. But I think, again, I know I said this earlier, but for me, the experience, we're talking just about anxiety. I mean, we talk about anxiety as a mental thing. Anxiety is a whole body thing, right? Anxiety is a neurochemical, physiological response, And so, of course, we will have felt it, not just in this context, but in other contexts as well. But for me, what really makes eco-anxiety distinct is what we're required to do as a result of it, And that's what makes it, I think, in my mind, distinct from nuclear anxiety. We talked a lot about COVID and re-entry anxiety coming out of lockdown and all these kinds of things, all very similar in their existential nature. When it comes to the climate crisis, it's what it then requires of us, that could lead us towards feeling a sense of perfectionism, or feeling a sense of burnout, or and that's the real challenge here is to keep people sustained, I think.
And if I can just add, I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge how it's really important for us to validate the emotions of climate anxiety, because it's not like, it's a monster hiding under your bed and, oh, don't worry, darling. It's like, this is actually very real and valid, and what you're going through is very valid. So thank you again for sharing.
Yeah, and Patrick, I think your delineation of what makes the climate and eco-anxiety different is spot on compared to other forms of existential threat when it comes especially to war and nuclear and things like this.
Yeah.
However, what they all have in common, whether we're talking about anxiety from war, anxiety from the violence of histories of colonization, slavery, other forms of oppression that really push down on people and cause intergenerational trauma. All of it messes with our sense of ontological security, so the belief that we are safe in the world, right? And when that gets disrupted, it can have huge impact psychologically in terms of our affect, our feelings, but our cognitions and our thoughts and also our behavior. And this is very normal and to be expected. And it comes back to that quote that, you know, it's no sign of health to be adjusted to a sick society, right? That it's okay to feel these things in the light of things that are impressing upon us that we should actually now not feel safe in the world. And then another similarity is this concept of moral injury, that when we are caught up in a system that is violating our conscience and our integrity and what we think is right, violating right and wrong, then we also have a profound psychological harm to experience. And that comes with, you know, maybe being the citizen of a nation that's engaging in a war that you don't believe in, or being a citizen in a country that is dismissing and disavowing the importance of climate action. So 2 other features that I think can help us speak across multiple issues.
I'm learning lots as I sit on this panel, so that's cool. I would also just say that I think for Gen Z, it's a unique experience for us because we're the first truly connected generation. We're the first generation growing up in a really globalized world. And so that means that, you know, from the age of 9 having Facebook, I've been plugged into all of the problems all of the time for my entire childhood, basically. And so the beauty of that is that we see all of the interconnectedness and all of the intersectionality. Like, we recognize, I talk to 12 and 13-year-olds in the classroom who are like, yeah, the climate crisis is a symptom of a capitalist economic system that commodifies nature and exploits vulnerable communities and is a product of colonialism. And, you know, there's this deep understanding for the root of the crisis. But naturally, that also leads to a huge feeling of overwhelm because we see the problems everywhere and we see how enormous they are. And we see that we've inherited fundamentally broken systems. But that is also an invitation to rethink so much of what we've inherited and ask, you know, that critical question of what if we did things differently? And if we open the door to our kind of childlike capacity for imagination and creativity and innovation, then that's a really exciting invitation to say, what if we did do things differently? And how could I be a custodian of a future by my own design? Like, how can I leave my fingerprints on the future that we all inherit?
Love that. Thank you. We're going to look for another question in the crowd. If anyone else would like to ask our experts, I'm seeing some hands over here. ChangeNOW team. There's one at the front. Oh, we already have a microphone set up. All right, beautiful. Sir, what's your question?
Thank you. So I am personally living with this and dealing with this eco-anxiety, and so my age allowed me to see a different world because I am already more than 50 years old. So I saw how the things got worse in the last years, and I think that the best way to deal with this eco-anxiety is actually to ask ourselves, what can we do to change something? And this is struggling me every day, because sometimes I think the only way to get out of this wheel we're all running in to keep this global engine going on is actually close ourselves into a cave and live into the nature. But this is not something which is feasible. So the choice that we face every day to think about what is our impact on this, they find a lot of compromise every day. So because you can make a choice, but then there is some other effect on something else. So it's different to find the right way to reduce the impact of our actions. For example, we are here, and I'm asking myself, the global impact of this event here, is it counterbalanced by the actions that we can face, that we can take here? I don't know. So my question to you all, I don't know to whom ask you, how can we find a solution to that? Because you were mentioning this, so we are giving to our government, we are giving to people that maybe know more about that. the responsibility to give us answers, but maybe we are trusting people who are not trustable. So that's I'm personally struggling every day with this, and so I don't have an answer to that. So I hope that I can get one from you. Thank you.
Responses?
I would say give up the myth of perfection and the myth that this is the fault of the individual. If you're here, you are doing your best, and it's okay that you're feeling anxious about what you're doing and your your individual responses. It sounds like you're probably already taking a lot of action. Put pressure on the governments to change. Put pressure on the systems to change. Vote with your wallet. Continue to take the action that you're taking. Lean into others and talk to people about how you're feeling and what actions you're taking, because they do spread. But sometimes I think if people are highly active, they actually need to give themselves permission not to be perfect in this space.
I'm happy to offer a really tangible resource, which is a book called Regeneration, edited by Paul Hogan. It's kind of the next edition of Project Drawdown, which was the first ever comprehensive plan of solutions for the climate crisis. And Regeneration, it's just this amazing kind of collection of solutions that are very much grounded in social justice. How do we build fair and equitable communities? Not techno-utopian solutions far off into the future that are going to continue to line the pockets of a few billionaires. Really, really cool solutions. And they've created something which you can find at regeneration.org called the Nexus, which unpacks all of these solutions in terms of where money needs to go, where resource needs to go. And my favorite part of the Nexus is a section called Bad Actors. And it shows within industry the companies that are disproportionately contributing to these issues, whether it's plastic pollution or tropical deforestation. And Paul and his team have done quite a cheeky thing, which is including the email and phone number to each CEO of all of these companies, so that you can have a direct path of communication to them. And it shows what you can do on an organizational level, a community level, and also an individual level.
I love that. I didn't know about that. I'm going to get that book. Your comment is so apt, and I thank you for it. I think it really expresses a lot of the difficulty that many of us are living with, because we can't reconcile this problem within ourselves as individuals, which is incredibly challenging on a psychological level. And so I think we need to get comfortable with our ambivalence. We need to embrace how inconsequential we might be within this, and know that that's okay, and have compassion for ourselves as we continue to band together with others and do the work and roll up our sleeves and create the conditions of hope. Not that we need hope in order to act, but that when we come together, we do something, we actually produce the conditions for hope, and we often get that formula backwards. So yes, use our democracies, yes, continue taking the action, but also understand that this is a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of connection to other people who we see as living in disposable places. It's a crisis to other species. It's a crisis to the future of connection to other generations not yet born. And so I think something that can really help when we're dealing with the fact that we can't reconcile this is considering your own spiritual re-knitting, right? And what will foster connections that fill you up to be able to take this on, because it is really hard.
All right.
Yeah, I was just, there's so many wonderful ideas. I was thinking, what can I possibly add to that apart from run to the computers, check out the regeneration? I suppose just another tangible idea is, because the thing that immediately popped into my mind was a book. Actually, he's sitting right there. Mark Maslin, who's a climate scientist. He wrote a book called How to Save Our Planet: The Facts, and it separates into 3 areas. Sort of 15 evidence-based things we can do as individuals, 15 evidence-based things we can do as corporations, 15 evidence-based things that we can do at governmental level. But what I have to stress about this is these are ideas, they're not requirements, in the sense that kind of, if you're sitting here kind of engaging in a conference like this and still feeling that sense of kind of inherent climate guilt, this speaks much more to the system that's trying to hold you individually accountable. That's what I think that message is kind of across the board on the panel today, is that, the last thing people in this audience should be feeling is guilty right now. You know, it just doesn't. It's not. You know, so I think use these ideas, and there's some great ideas mentioned today. But use them as a guide and anchor them onto your values, to your spiritual meaning. But don't feel a sense of kind of climate perfectionism and they're all required all the time, because that's it's impossible. It's impossible to live a life and do all of that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Do we have another question somewhere in the crowd? I'm seeing over here. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hello, my name is Felipe. Thank you for this session. I personally don't think that I have a lot of eco-anxiety, but I could relate a lot when, Clover, you said the pain you felt with the Australia fires, because I come from Bolivia, and I do remember the feeling of unpowerfulness and of kind of anxiety because of the fires in the Amazon on 2018 and 2020. But what can I do as someone for my family and friends that are in Bolivia to ease their anxiety and help to reduce anxiety as a friend or as a family member? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. How do we support people? What can we do?
Good.
We can be there for one another. Give license to one another to feel and feel deeply without judgment. Something that is often left out of the climate anxiety conversation is that in many ways it's a privilege for me to have the space to feel eco-anxiety and to almost decide when I want to switch that off, because there are many people, perhaps like your family, who are already living through the direct impacts of the climate crisis, who don't have that privilege afforded to them. It is their day-to-day lived experience. It's not, something that's coming down the road for them. And so creating space for them to be able to share how this experience makes them feel, and to ask that question of them, how can I support you? What do you need from me? I sense would be a really good place to start. But
I think that's perfectly said. It's one of the most human things we can do, and it really does offer genuine support. And one quote that always stays with me from the author and activist Adrienne Marie Brown is, "What you pay attention to grows." And it's so true. And you can ask people in your life who you care about what they want to pay attention to that would be nourishing and joyful, and how you can step into that space with them to pay attention, to bring it forth. In addition to talking about the tough stuff, we need to make ourselves wide enough to bring in all of the wonderful, firm, grounding, positive things that are also true at this time. And so sometimes just a reminder that these things are also there, and that the anxiety and distress can narrow the window and foreclose ideas of that, can be a way that we can really create more flexible feeling and thinking about this with others.
Wonderful. Beautiful. Okay.
I think just something else to say is, and I'm so glad this came up as a question. I really thank you for raising this. It's okay if you're not feeling eco-anxiety as well. It doesn't mean that you don't care. And this is something that comes up a lot as well. People say, I really care about all of this, but I'm not sure I'm quite feeling what you're describing. I love that you followed that up by saying, how can I help the people around me? Really, really important. It reminds me of, in sort of other guises in the past, having conversations with family members in acute hospitals, or, where I worked before. And they say kind of, in grief situations, in serious medical situations, they say, what can I do? I can see the suffering of the people I love. What can I do about it? Actually, the answer to that is really very simple, and you guys have absolutely nailed it, is just create a space for them. Validate how they're feeling. It doesn't need to be an active thing other than just to open a door, and if they want to reach out to you, that they feel they can, that's a really important step.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have officially exhausted our time together. However, I know that our experts will be wandering around, and I know that you'll have many more questions. You can always turn to the resources. If you take note of the speakers, the various initiatives that they run, go look online, get yourself informed, read some of these wonderful books if you want to hold them up. I don't know where you put them, ladies, sorry.
We love each other's books too, so that's a good thing.
But continue to get informed and inspired, and keeping in mind that, like the experts have said here today, this is an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing journey for all of us here on planet Earth. We're doing our very best. It doesn't have to be perfect. If we experience some big emotions, let's just make the space for that as much as we can and support each other as best as possible, I think is what I come out of this with. So a big, big thank you to our wonderful experts today. And a big, big thank you to you, our audience, for your questions, for your engagement, and for your curiosity on a subject that I learned a lot about today as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.